We've all seen the assessments that American democracy is backsliding, and sharply. And it has profound implications, not just for the United States, but for the world. The United States has been the standard bearer of democracy, its global champion. But recent events raise the questions, can it still play that role credibly and effectively? And if not, who will? With me here to discuss, Fogh Rasmussen. He is a former Secretary General of NATO, former Prime Minister of Denmark, and founder of the Alliance of Democracies. Also with us is Senator Michael Bennet, a Democrat from Colorado, representing them, of course, in the U.S. Senate. Thank you both for being with us here today. Secretary General, let me start with you. I'm wondering if you could give us the view from outside of the United States. Does American democracy look healthy or unhealthy?
American democracy looks healthy, and we need a strong and determined American global leadership. The US represents the oldest democracy in the world. It's still the strongest democracy, and it is a resilient democracy. So America is still able to lead the free world, and we do need determined American global leadership. We know from history that when the US retreats, it will leave behind a vacuum, and that vacuum will be filled by the bad guys. And that's exactly what we have seen recently.
Senator Bennet, I'd like to get your view from essentially the heart of American democracy, Capitol Hill. We have seen the Senate fail to pass voting rights legislation. We haven't seen full accountability for the events of January 6th. At state houses, we see gerrymandering. We see efforts to suppress voting of certain populations, efforts to politicize the machinery of elections. I'm wondering whether you believe American democracy is healthy.
I think that overall it is healthy. I'd agree with Anders on that, but I think we're in an extremely fragile state. I just was in Europe a month ago in Anders' old stomping grounds in Brussels is where we started, went to Scotland, went to Germany, then to the Middle East, to Israel and Qatar. And in the democracies where we visited, it was very clear to us that people are facing the same challenges we're facing, the rise of extremism, a rise of anti-Semitism, real concern about what social media is doing to polarize people in our societies. And it also is very clear to me that Anders was correct in saying we have to lead. Everybody else was saying, look, we can make it, but we can't make it without you. And to me, there are two important elements to that for the United States. One is to secure the vote. Jeanne, as you mentioned, we just had a failure on that here in the United States Senate. In Colorado, we have a system of voting, of mail-in voting and other kinds of voting that's absolutely fraud-free, that's been developed by Republicans and Democrats, that results in our having the second largest voter turnout in the country. I wish that for every other citizen in America, and I'm fighting to try to do that because I think that's an important element. Just as important, I think, when you think about the American example after World War II, we've always been most persuasive when we stood for both freedom and voting and that kind of, and opportunity. And today, there's real question about whether or not we're providing opportunity in the United States. I live, again, in Colorado, one of the most dynamic economies in America. And if I had to summarize the last 12 years of town halls, it's really easy. It's people coming and saying, Michael, we're killing ourselves, and we cannot afford some combination of housing, health care, higher education, or early childhood education, many of which is provided in countries in Europe for free. We can't save. We feel like our kids are going to live a more diminished life than we live. And that's a moment in a democracy's life when tyrants show up and say, I alone can fix it. You don't need the democracy. You don't need the rule of law. So I think we have a big piece of work ahead of us, which is to create an economy that when it grows for everybody, not just the people at the very top. And I think in the face of the rise of China, we have a very interesting opportunity to work with our allies around the world, including in Europe, to create an economic model that competes well and ably with China and helps us strengthen our democracy.
Senator, if I might follow up, Secretary Rasmussen was unequivocal in saying the U.S. does have the credibility to lead. Do you think the U.S. has the credibility to lead, given everything that's happening in Washington and in state houses?
Yeah, I think we do, in part because Donald Trump was a one-term president. If we had re-elected Donald Trump, I think there would have been a real question about our credibility. But now the question in front of us is what we had the largest number of people in American history turned out to vote in a pandemic. And because of that, Donald Trump was a one-term president, and we saved the democracy for the moment. I think the question now in front of us is, what are we going to do with that moment? What are we going to do with that rescue plan or opportunity that the American people gave us? And Jeanne, I think that's going to require us to earn credibility by making progress here, both as a democracy and economically.
Secretary General, I've heard you say often that for democracy to be successful, it has to deliver to its citizens. Is American democracy delivering to its own citizens?
Yeah, basically, yes. And basically, I think many Americans are too critical about their own system. On the other hand, that's the strength of democracy, that we can afford self-criticism compared to the autocratic systems that do not allow such internal criticism. But of course, we need a more functional Congress. I think in recent years, we have seen too much partisanship. We need the two major parties to work closer together. So I think a dysfunctional Congress may be a challenge in the coming years. But basically, we need three things to make sure that democracies will be stronger in the future. First, of course, as mentioned, they must demonstrate a capability to deliver concrete results to the people. Secondly, we should reunite. We should avoid divisions within our societies, but also among democracies. We should not allow divisions between America and Europe, and in Europe we also have to be more united, for instance, in our approach to Russia, etc. And then finally, I also think it's important to stop what I would call the self-doubt about our values. The fact is that no other system in the world has ever produced so many opportunities for people as freedom and democracy. So we have a lot to be proud of, and we have to promote those values instead of continuously criticizing ourselves and doubt the value of our system. Only the autocrats will gain from such self-doubt.
Senator, you're living in the middle of this stark polarization on Capitol Hill, which, by the way, is manifested all over the country. Can we overcome our divisions? Can we stop the self-doubt? Can we deliver?
Yeah, I think we can deliver. I absolutely agree that this is a moment where we have to stand up for democracy. Look, you know, the founders didn't create this country imagining that we would agree with each other. They thought we were going to disagree with each other. And the genius of democracy was, out of that disagreement, we were going to create more imaginative and hopefully more durable results than any king or tyrant could come up. I know, because at the moment, we're not living up to either the founding ideals or the purpose of the democracy. But let me give you an example in Anders' terms of how we could deliver. I think we could deliver right now by reversing the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy and by extending my child tax credit, which is cutting childhood poverty in our country almost in half and benefiting 90% of the American people. I ran a completely unnoticed campaign for president on the idea that we could do that we could cut childhood poverty almost in half if we wanted to, and we were able to do it because Joe Biden included it in the American Rescue Plan. Listen, Jeanne, I do not. I represent a state that's a third, Democratic, Republican, Independent. I can tell you they are nowhere near as polarized as the polarization in Washington, D.C. The polarization in Washington, D.C. and on the cable and on the social media is creating a polarization in the country, not the other way around. And I think we've got to find ways to build, especially when autocracy is on the march across the world, we've got to find ways to strengthen the agenda. And I think there is a set of policies that can allow us to do it. In the short term, I would agree with you that politicians in Washington have not been up to it, but in American history in many ways is a story of failing and succeeding. And I think we're on the cusp of being able to do that.
Secretary General, we have seen democratic movements in Hong Kong, in Myanmar, and Belarus effectively quashed. How do you assess the response from the world's democracy? And what has to change?
Overall, the response has been too weak. And I think that's exactly what is happening now. The autocrats test us. Putin tests the resolve and the unity or division between the world's democracies. Xi Jinping of China does exactly the same, and he is following closely what is going on now in Ukraine, because if Putin can get away with his aggression against Ukraine almost without any costs, then Xi Jinping would take that as a signal that he can also attack Taiwan without any cost. So how we respond to those aggressions, Russian and Chinese, will determine the future of our world. And history has taught us that appeasement with dictators does not lead to peace. On the contrary, it leads to war and conflict. So the only language understood in Moscow and Beijing is a language of force, strength, and unity. And we should never forget that together the world's democracies represent 70% of the global economy. So if we could stand together globally, then we represent a massive force that will create some respect in both Beijing and Moscow.
And yet we are seeing divisions in the free world, even within NATO. Viktor Orban going to Moscow, Germany holding back on military aid. So what hope is there to form an effective alliance of democracies, as you have proposed?
I take President Biden's initiative to organize a global summit for democracy at the beginning of December as a first very important step in that direction. It should not be a one-off event, and the American administration has already announced that it will be followed up in a year's time with a new physical democracy summit. So I think we have now started a year of action. And I hope if I may, that the Copenhagen Democracy Summit that will take place on the 9th and 10th of June this year, exactly half a year after Biden's summit, can be a stock-taking summit where we can evaluate progress among the world's democracies in fulfilling the pledges they issued in Washington 2 months ago. So I think we have started a process that will lead to at least stronger cooperation between the world's democracies. I hope that cooperation could also involve what we call an economic Article 5. Inspired by my past as NATO Secretary General, we have launched the idea that the world's democracies should consider an economic attack on one country as an attack on all, and we should help each other economically if the Chinese try to threaten Australia, Lithuania, or who else it might be.
They're doing it now, aren't they? They're trying to put a chokehold on Lithuania.
They are, and that's exactly why the world's democracies should come to the aid of Lithuania instead of accepting that they are exposed to Chinese coercion.
So the world's democracies aren't doing it. Is that a demonstration of the lack of American leadership?
Well, I think the 4 years during the Trump term was a disastrous period where the world started to doubt American global leadership. Then President Biden was elected and he promised America is back, and all in Europe were relieved. But I think what we need now is to see a clear commitment to that global American leadership. We need to see concrete initiatives, because if we do not see more American leadership, then we will all recall the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan as an example of the lack of American global leadership. So they still hope, and I think the summit, the Biden summit on democracy at the beginning of December was a first important step, but it must be followed up by more concrete initiatives.
Senator Bennet, authoritarians have used technology to great effect for disinformation, for example. What do you believe that the United States and the rest of the world's democracies have to do to try to blunt the impact?
Let me just say first, Jeanne, on this, that this is another place where we told ourselves a lullaby about what China was going to do. You remember American politicians and other politicians who were saying the effect of the internet was going to be that China was somehow going to liberalize, and the reality has been they have used it to export their surveillance state all over the world with tools that George Orwell could never have imagined, while we're in effect sinking into chaos because of the way social media is affecting democracy. So this is, I think, a very, very important point that you raise, and anybody who's studied our history knows how vital America's technological leadership has been to democracy. You know, think about for a moment if what it would have meant for democracy if Hitler and not Truman had won the race for a nuclear weapon, or if Soviet scientists and engineers and not America's had consistently dominated the latest Cold War technologies, or more recently if the internet had emerged from a PLA research lab instead of DARPA. This is where we find ourselves, and America's technology leadership gave democracy a crucial edge in the 20th century. The question is whether, that will remain true in the 21st century, because if we don't act and if we don't work together, as Anders said, with our allies all over the world, we're going to lose ground. China is not waiting for us to get our house in order. They've connected almost 90% of their consumers to ultra-fast internet, while there are kids in Colorado that have to do their homework in Walmart parking lots because we're at 25%. They're building factories with electric vehicles as fast as the rest of the world combined. They've tripled their doctorate degrees in science and engineering over the past 20 years. We should be working with Europe and other democracies around the world to make sure that we are, up to the task of matching them in doing that. And they've done it, as I said, by relying on tools that Stalin could only dream of, to entrench their surveillance state by vacuuming up data about their citizens every internet search and financial transaction and facial expression, to say nothing of the smart cities they've created around the world. So China is pursuing a China first policy by any means necessary. The question for us is whether we're content, and for democracy, I would say, is whether we are content to be collateral damage, or whether we're going to offer a compelling alternative and show the world that democracy can meet the challenges of the 21st century. I strongly believe we can, but we need a new approach, and that needs to be an approach where we are side by side with our democratic allies across the world, in Europe and other regions.
Senator, do we not only have to match them, do we have to look forward and contemplate emerging technologies, still developing technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing? And is enough effort being put in that direction?
I'm a member of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate, and often that's, when I say that, people say it's misnamed, but it is where we do that kind of work. And I think there is a realization, in fact, the realization that we were being unmatched on 5G because of Huawei, and that there were European allies of ours that were at danger of buying that technology. We blew the whistle on that here, and we are looking very closely at AI and quantum computing. These technologies are what we should be focused on to understand what our national security is going to require, what our intelligence will require when you think about what these new tools are what the implications are for things like encryption and communication. We definitely should be focused forward, not backward.
I'd like to ask you both, as we wrap up here, to answer one question quite quickly. Is there one thing that you think the United States can and should do to restore confidence in America's ability to credibly carry the banner of democracy? Secretary General Rasmussen, why don't you take that first?
So one single thing, if I have to point to one single thing, I would say to make sure that the summit for democracy at the beginning of December last year will not be a one-off, but will be followed up by concrete examples and initiatives and engagement of civil society in democracies globally.
Senator?
Let me underscore the Prime Minister's one thing, which gives me another one thing, but I completely agree with what he said. My one thing is that I think that we can lead the democracies around this world in a competition with China that can show that democracy and freedom are better ways for humans to live than under an autocratic state, and that we can compete economically, delivering prosperity for our people. That is, in some ways, the most important thing I think we can do to show people around the world that democracy is still a viable way for humanity to organize themselves. The Trump experience for me has made me even more committed to democracy than I was before he showed up, and I think we've got an incredible opportunity to lead the rest of the world.
And we will leave it there. Senator Michael Bennet, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, founder of the Alliance of Democracies, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.